Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to come to this conference and talk about a subject that has been of interest for me and some colleagues in Uppsala for at least 20 years. And that subject is the role of the savings banks in the Swedish banking and financial system since the early 19th century. This research project is a brand new one. It's not about the history of the savings banks, it's about contemporary savings banks. And the underlying question is actually, is there a future for the old-time traditional trustee savings banks or not? As a point of departure, you have to know that the Swedish banking system has been dominated by two categories of banks: the private, profit-maximizing commercial banks that early on developed into universal banks, inspired by the German universal banks, and the second category of banks is the savings banks. As you already know, they are semi-public organizations where the local society always has had a great influence. And the savings banks are not, by definition, not profit maximizing. They do need to be profitable and efficient in order to survive, but profits are to stay within and to benefit the local society. And these two categories of banks, the commercial banks and the savings banks, they are always competed. They have been fair competitors. The cooperative banks have never played an important role in Swedish banking, and neither have the state-owned banks. Okay. I will use this diagram of the number of individual savings banks in Sweden to make some very short comments on the history of savings banks. From the 1860s and onwards, we had a dense network of savings banks in Sweden. And we had, after that, we have parallel processes of industrial and financial revolution. And the savings banks actually did play a decisive role in developing local deposit and credit markets and in distributing capital from savings to investments. In the late 19th century, the concept of natural order was introduced regarding the institutional setup, and it was set up that the banks were not to compete. The commercial banks were to invest in the industry, and the savings banks were to invest the depositors' money more safely. However, in the late 1960s, when the number have been decreasing a lot, the concept of the natural order became obsolete, and we had regulations that was set up to make the banks to compete, of course. And in the late 1980s, the merger wave continued and resulted in 11 very large regional savings banks. But they still felt that they were losing ground to the commercial banks, and they decided to convert into one commercial bank, one limited company, under the name of the Savings Bank of Sweden, or Swedbank, that it later changed its name to. The Swedbank was a bank that was to continue to cooperate with the savings banks that did not want to join Swedbank or to convert into limited companies. And of course, a new Savings Banks Act was introduced that allowed the trustees' savings banks to convert themselves. So, from the early 90s, we had what is sometimes referred to as a Swedish savings bank sector that consists of three parts, three components. We have Swedbank, that is a limited company listed on the Stockholm Stock Exchange since 1995. It has about 300,000 shareholders, and it's a commercial profit-maximizing bank. Then we have the limited savings banks. These are limited companies, but they are owned by foundations. They are kind of hybrid savings banks. There are 13 of them. And in some of them, Swedbank owns minority shares. And then we have about 50 the traditional trustee savings banks. And they are all governed by the same Banking Act and supervised by the same financial institution, authority. So when it came to market shares, the creation of the Swedish savings bank sector was successful. They managed to compete with the other banks during the late 20th and early 21st century, and this goes for many other sub-markets within the Swedish banking sector. So it seems that this strategic alliance has been somewhat effective and fruitful for the parties involved. If you look a little bit closer on this strategic alliance, one key component is the master agreement, a 5-year agreement that regulates what products and services Swedbank offers to the savings banks and the prices of these, of course. So the customers in the two forms of saving banks are offered the services of, for example, Robur, Sweden's largest fund manager, and of Swedbank Mortgage, which is Sweden's largest mortgage company. And Swedbank also, which is very important, provides the savings banks with an IT platform which they would never have been able to finance themselves. On the other hand, Swedbank relies heavily on the savings banks in selling the products. They account for about 30% of Swedbank's product sales on the Swedish markets. And the strategic alliance is also held together by ownership. The savings banks have established a consortium that owns a little bit more than 10% of Swedbank, making them the single biggest owner of Swedbank. On the other hand, Swedbank also holds, as I said, minority shares in a number of the limited savings banks. In this structure, alliance, the National Association of Savings Banks also plays an important part in assisting the savings banks in relation to the much bigger Swedbank. And they are supporting them, for example, with compliance, an aspect as we heard has been more and more difficult for especially small banks to handle. However, which is obvious for everyone, there are some challenges that have to be handled, some internal potential conflicts. One is that there's 3 different organizational forms within this alliance, and hence also 3 modes of corporate governance. Swedbank being a listed company with a lot of international institutional investors, so they have to be profit maximizing, or these institutional investors will sell their shares. The limited savings banks are also stressing profitability as a key element, but on the other hand, they are owned by foundations, which in turn want to support the development of their local societies. And we have the trustee savings banks, which are also depending on being profitable and are striving to become more efficient and professional. And they are especially focusing on developing the role of the trustees in order to activate them and make them a resource in developing the trustee savings banks. The geographical location of the partners in the alliance is also a potential problem. Swedbank and the limited savings banks are localized in the large urban growth areas, and they have the majority of the customers there, whilst the trustee savings banks are mostly located in the more rural areas of Sweden, areas that are stagnating from a demographic and economic perspective. And another problem, challenge is that they have a very different views on customer availability regarding physical branch offices. Swedbank has cut down the number of branches from 600 15 years ago to about 200 today, whilst the savings banks have chosen to keep most of the branches open, actually. So there are a number of challenges within this strategic alliance. There are some, if you want to be really optimistic, you can notice that Swedbank has, in recent years, in their branding, the marketing, they have recognized their common historical legacy, stemming back to the early 19th century. But this is a development that we have only seen in the last 4 or 5 years. So this is the point of departure of our project, and whether the trustee savings banks have a future or not, well, I'm not that optimistic actually, due to several reasons. But that's, thank you.
Thank you.